Yeah, I think we can start. Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at the George Washington University. I am Melanie Sadozai. I'm a postdoc fellow here at IRIS, and I'm honored to moderate today's event with Beate Eschment and Sabine von Lewis to talk about the book they've recently edited on post-Soviet borders, and that just got released. Let me first remind the audience to ask their questions in the chat box at the bottom of the Zoom, and I'll read them out loud to our speakers after their presentation. And before getting into the book, I'd like to introduce our two speakers today. I'm very honored to have them here. They're both researchers at the Center for East European and International Studies, also known as ZOIS in Berlin. We have Beate Eschment, thank you for being here, who is a Central Asia expert at ZOIS. She has been working extensively in and on Central Asia, and in Kazakhstan particularly. Her research focuses on inter-ethnic relations, national minorities, political transition in the region, protests, and of course, border issues. And her most recent publications address questions about the ethnic and civic identity of the citizens of Kazakhstan. We also have Sabine von Lewis, thank you, who is a geographer and head of the research cluster Conflict Dynamics and Border Regions at ZOIS. And she's part of many research projects there as well. And her fields of research include phantom borders, everyday geopolitics, and de facto states, with a focus on Moldova and Ukraine. So I encourage our audience to check ZOIS' website to see all the publications. And this book is really a product of both Sabine and Beate's research expertise, as it showcases the impacts of space reorganization on border regions and ethnic minorities, and it emphasizes the importance of correlating different scales. Or to quote you in the introduction, I quote, "The border can be understood as a space that is neither purely national nor local," of quotes. And with that in mind, I give now the floor to Beate to tell us more about the content and maybe start with a few questions that you do tackle in the book. So why this book, why now, and why this title?
Yeah, hello, good morning. Nice to have you all, at least at the monitor or behind the monitor. We are very pleased to present our book to you today, and a big thank you from both of us to Melanie for the invitation. What are we going to do now? In the beginning, I will inform you about the background of the creation of the book and give a brief overview of its content. And then Sabine will present the underlying concept. And after that, of course, Melanie already mentioned it, we hope for many questions and comments from your side. So let's start with the prehistory, the backstory. The book emerged from two workshops that Sabine and I organized. The idea was the result of the multidisciplinary approach of our institute, the Center for East European and International Studies, ZOIS, here in Berlin. We conduct research on a wide range of current issues in the entire post-Soviet space in our institute. Our colleagues are not only political scientists and sociologists, but also cultural scientists, social anthropologists. We have a theologian. Sabine is a geographer by education, and I'm, as already mentioned, expert on Central Asia. When Sabine, as a proven border researcher, once reported internally on her field research results in Ukraine, we noticed interesting similarities as well as differences to the Central Asian border, or better, to the Central Asia border conflicts. And the idea arose to bring together researchers and research results on the different borders in the former Soviet Union area. The result was a first workshop in Berlin in autumn 2018 entitled "Borders from Below: Processes of re- and debordering within the post-Soviet space," with focus on people living in border regions, how they imagine, perceive, and produce borders. Encouraged by the participants, we organized a second workshop about a year later, at Tbilisi State University, this time entitled Studying Border Regions in the Post-Soviet Space, Different Methods, Scales, and Areas. In both cases, we invited academics who had currently done research in border regions, doctoral students as well as proven experts, and this was very important to us, from the so-called Western world and the states of the former Soviet Union. At least participants came from Germany, Austria, France, Finland, Georgia, Ukraine and Russia, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. At both workshops, there were also methodological lectures and in Tbilisi, intensive discussions about ethical questions in border research and an exchange of experiences about personal burdens in field research on borders, which for various reasons are not represented in the book. As in many cases before, at the end of the workshops, the idea of publishing the contributions arose. We are very grateful to the editors of the Routledge Borderland Studies, that is James W. Scott and Ilka Likan, that they also saw the benefit of such a publication and were willing to include our book in their series. What happened next, you all know, not all participants of the workshops could or wanted to participate and so on. In the end, 9 of the 12 articles in the volume come from presentations at our workshops. The field research on which they are based was, with one exception, all carried out between 2015 and 2020. So they are, I guess, quite up to date. Although the editing of the individual text was very labor-intensive and time-consuming. In the end, we could send the whole convolute of data files to the publisher at the beginning of January 2022. And at that moment, we, of course, didn't know how important this date was and what that would change very quickly. This brings me to a brief overview of the content. After Sabine's detailed introduction, the content of which she will report on in more detail in a moment, the first contributions of the volumes are intended to serve as a general orientation or framing. Sabine Ketevan-Kutishvili and I give a joint overview of the dynamics of bordering since the end of the Soviet Union. Tatiana Zhurzenko, now our colleague at SOIS, presents the development of post-Soviet border studies, that means its fragmentation after 1991. And Stefan Rindlinsbacher from the Viadrina University in Frankfurt-Oder presents the challenges of border demarcation in the early Soviet Union based on news sources. I personally find the following contribution by Martel Wenken and Johanna Jaschik particularly exciting. They use 2 dialogues from their citizen science project named Talking Borders between young borderland inhabitants from today's Ukraine, Poland, and Hungary to present their different perspective on the borders with Ukraine, or better, within Ukraine. Then follow the geographically structures contributions on the situation in the various border regions. Because of the special situation at the borders, they are, of course, often based on field research on one side of a border only. Rita Sanders investigates questions of the entanglement of trust and mistrust on the border between the EU and the Russian Federation in the Kaliningrad Oblast. Nikita Turov and other researchers from Lomonosov University and the Academy of Science in Moscow show how tricky the inhabitants of Bender and, to a lesser extent, Dubasari dealt with the de facto border between Moldova and Transnistria, and how many gaps or leaks this border, which one would have expected to be hermetically closed, actually on the local level had until 2020. The South Caucasus is represented by 3 contributions. Ariane Bachelet, a PhD student at the Institute of Geography at the Sorbonne in Paris, describes the process of borderization on the border of South Ossetia with the rest of Georgia, and how rivalries between international actors affect the lives of the population negatively. Nino Ivashvili-Gene examines the Soviet and post-Soviet perception of the Georgian-Azerbaijani border using the example of the Ingiloi, a Georgian-speaking minority in Azerbaijan. And Nino is able to show through the example of individual encounters that the post-Soviet state border is a hindrance for them in many respects. And Georgi Kheshvili examines the development of relations between Georgians and in Batumi and the Turkish province of Artvin, who were able to re-establish personal contact from 1988 onwards after decades of separation. And that was the interesting result that the former physical barrier became a social and symbolic boundary. The border problems in the Central Asia, Fergana Valley, are dealt with in 2 articles in our book. Based on interviews and surveys in 2016 and 2020 in the Isfara Valley, that is a side valley of the Fergana Valley, and borders there are very disputed between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. The 2 Tajik scholars, Saudat Olimova and her husband, Mustafa Olimov, show that there are not only conflictogenic tendencies, but some integrative ones as well, which gave some hope. However, this was before the escalation of 2021 and especially 2022, to our regret. Situation there changed a lot, I'm afraid. Asiel Musakulova from the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek focuses in her contribution on the Kyrgyz-Uzbek border and the transformation of infrastructure in the Fergana Valley after the reopening of the border in 2016, and shows, among other things, that although the opening has led to improvements, many hopes associated with it have not yet been fulfilled. And last but not least, Henrik Alf's field research in Kazakhstan's district bordering China in the southeastern part of Kazakhstan shows that the opportunities for improving the economic situation of the farmers there through more open borders are not being fulfilled due to Kazakhstani restrictions and legislation. So that's it. Sabine now will inform you about how this kaleidoscope of diverse borderline situations, research questions, and theoretical approaches was brought together in one book, and what we believe to be the most important result. Thank you from my side.
Thank you so much, Beat, for giving us the backstory and an overview of the book. I wanted just to mention that there is open access content, that the introduction, conclusion, and the first 2 chapters of the book were open access and can be downloaded directly on Routledge, the website, Routledge's website. So I encourage everyone interested to download those 4 chapters of the book. I'll now give the floor to Sabina, who will get into more details about the theoretical background of the book.
Melanie, looks like we lost Sabina.
Lost Sabina, okay. So, Beata, did you want to say a few words about the theoretical background, or?
I will take the time to mention that we really would have paid a lot of money to make open access for all our chapters, but according to our rules and according to the rules of Routledge and the open access idea at all, to our regret, that was impossible. And because of that, it's only open access to chapters of colleagues of our institute.
So I just shared the link for people to download those chapters. So unfortunately, we lost Sabina. And until she comes back, I can probably start asking you a question until we have Sabine back. Can you elaborate on the subtitle of the book and the notion of kaleidoscope that you actually talk about it in the conclusion, but I thought it was very interesting if you could explain why you chose that title or why the editor chose that title.
No, when working on all the papers and the text of the book, we got the impression that we have rather different cases, different approaches. Of course, they are all situated in the former Soviet Union, and there are some. Oh, there's Sabine, and there are some similarities, but at all there are a lot of different cases, and sometimes even contradictory results. And so when you always have to think about a very speaking title, so that that people will notice your book. And so we thought that Kaleidoscope might be the right description, gives the right idea of what we are putting together. But I'm very happy to see Sabine again, yes, and hope that we can hear her now.
Yes, Sabine, please, I give you the floor.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, I somehow the internet kicked me out. But I hope it doesn't happen again. Sorry. But thank you also from my side for inviting and us to discuss the book. I will try to sketch a little bit the conceptual framework and highlight some aspects. And then, well, we can, I think you started the discussion already, but then we can continue the discussion. So a framing concept we use to understand and analyze border spaces or borderlands for the collective volume has been the threefold concept of space developed by Lefebvre. And it was a key concept during our workshops, and we have asked the authors to apply and use it as a framework for the contributions. So the different articles in the book examine like the materiality and structure of border spaces, the practices and routines in the border space, but also the narratives and imaginations of what border represents or which representations are at work. And as we choose a perspective from below, the studies apply an actor-centered approach, looking at individuals as well as collectives like local elites. And it can, however, not be ignored that changes in the borderlands are intertwined with power centers of states and with the state border in a traditional sense as a line between state territories, border regimes, as well as nation-building processes. So scaling up and down is in most cases part of the empirical cases. So the interaction between and entanglement of the state and the local or regional dynamics dealing with and shaping the new reality of a border are major schemes of the case studies in the book. And of course, not every dimension is present in every single contribution. And the three articles in the beginning address, as Beate already mentioned, more general perspectives, while the following papers deliver more or less thick descriptions of various borders and boundaries in the post-Soviet space. And we can distinguish between the external and the internal borders of the former Soviet Union and observe particular dynamics when it comes to perceptions, structures, practices, and imaginations of borders. And we also have, and Beate also mentioned that, contributions that deal with de facto borders, so borders which are not recognized and result from the secessionist conflicts of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and have, again, their own dynamics geopolitically and locally. And as Beate already has given an overview of the empirical cases of the book, I will briefly put them in the conceptual context we wanted to address. And I shall, of course, be short and indicate only some general outlines, but as the title Kaleidoscope of Shifting Lives and Lands, and you have just talked about it, suggests that reading the book in its entirety will reveal much more complex picture, as I will try to briefly sketch out. So first, maybe a little bit about the external borders and the prevailing or constructed narratives and imaginations creating divides. So 3 case studies address former external borders. So in Kaliningrad, a very peculiar border region between East and West, people look at each other from a perspective of trust, while a perspective of economic possibility reigns along the border between Kazakhstan and China. And this perspective is again embedded in persistent agricultural practices and routines, as well as in new options evolved from the eventually cross-border trade. And between Turkey and Georgia, however, a perspective of social and kin ties between families that had a chance to reunite after the opening of the border prevails. And this perspective leads to a perception of difference based on the past hard border and order, although new contacts and relations are possible and happening. And in all the cases, past dividing experiences of living a political or social life or doing agriculture in different state contexts overlay an exchange or reconnection with the other, although the latter was hoped for when they creating new opportunities of cross-border exchange. So while new opportunities of cross-border change and trans-border activities evolve, the constructions and reconstructions of mental borders continue to exist and perpetuate differences, despite an increasing contacts with the other side. And in a way, the cases of the 3 internal borders that turned into international borders seem to offer an opposite picture, but that obviously on another level. So in the Fergana Valley, the materiality of the infrastructure of water irrigation, pastures, roads, and the past routines and practices of management connected to the use of them across the demarcated international border contradict with the nationalizing territorialization. And the establishment of the demarcation and management of the border, those also contest the newly established national narratives and the established border. So experiences of a joint infrastructure management in the past, as well as new encounters based on trade and local diplomacy, are displayed as potential for negotiating conflict, which now very regularly evolves about tensions about bordering processes. And then the case study of the minority of the Ingiloi in the borderland between Azerbaijan and Georgia shows how the imagination of a group identity is kept across an increasingly materialized border, and practices and routines of exchange prevailed in the last 100 years and feed into a cross-border identity despite temporary enforcement of the border structures. And then finally, the 2 borders addressed in the book that are not recognized internationally, they result from secessionist conflict that occurred during the dissolution of the former Soviet Union. There's a de facto border between the separatist Transnistria, and it is running along the Dniester, and as for now more or less undisputed, apart from disputes about small pockets of land on each side, while the border between South Ossetia and Georgia is moving. Here we see borderization processes linked to an increasingly tightening border between Georgia and the separatist republic. And the ways in which the concerned entities deal with these 2 demarcation lines could not be more different between Moldova and Transnistria. Both sides developed and established routines and practices between administrations and locals that are much more interactive and cooperative than geopolitical significations of this and also other de facto borders should indicate. And the opposite is true for South Ossetian border with Georgia, not only in its constant changing, but in the extensive congruency between the geopolitical signification and representation and the practices and routines on the ground, especially when we consider the restriction on contacts along increasingly heavily militarized and controlled border. So when we interpret the empirical cases on the conceptual background of the threefold border space, the case studies show that narratives and imagination and routines and practices equally can enforce divides on the ground as well as they can overcome them. The conditions for the advent of the former or latter, an example, the establishment of the border as a dividing institution or a contact zone, are always specific and do those not allow an easy generalization. And the edited volume of post-Soviet borders shows or tries to show a variety of reconfigurations and dynamics that seem to show that the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the establishment of a new order has not come to an end yet. And it also reminds us that the borders are not stable, but a very dynamic process, and that somehow becomes, I think, very obvious in this collected volume and in the case studies. And yeah, I stop here, and that's what I wanted to say about the general concept idea of the book.
Thank you so much, Sabine, for giving us the theoretical background and conceptual background of the edited volume. So there are a few questions that we can address now, and so you briefly touched upon that, but you really are enriching with this book the body of literature on border studies, which has overlooked borders in this region. And you do address this question in the introduction, but what would you say is so specific about the borders in the post-Soviet space as opposed to other regions? It's a tricky question, but I think that's also one of the answers of the book that the book addresses.
Who wants to start, Beate or me? Well, it's really, thank you for the question. It's really a tricky question because I think a lot of issues that we see in border regions of the post-Soviet space are similar to other regions in the world. But on the other hand, and that I think shows also the historical article we have in the collected volume that shows how the borders were created in Soviet times. So there is this special Soviet idea and composition of the Soviet Union and the demarcation of the borders in the beginning of the 20s. So there is a special past of creating the Soviet Union, but then also of this dissolution that creates specificities, I think, in the context of the borders of the post-Soviet states. But still, I think there's more research actually necessary. I think there's not really a final answer to give to this question, because I think we would need research to compare other dissolution processes in other either empires or, for instance, the dissolution of the Yugoslavia in the different upcoming countries to really see what is the post-Soviet and what is what we observe in many other border regions as well. But maybe Beate has something to add to this.
Nothing really new, to be honest. We discussed this subject several times and couldn't come to real results, and because of that, we would say a little bit avoided to answer it in the conclusion. Nowadays the question is not only if there is something common in this post-Soviet borders, but there is a discussion about the term using the term post-Soviet anymore, that it's in a much broader context. And so I think it will take much more time and thoughts to come to a decision, not only in our case, but concerning the term at all.
Yes, it's a debate that's it's been going on now for a couple of years. Until when can we use the term post-Soviet? That's very interesting. So we have a question maybe for Beata, because it relates to your own research interests. What is the nature of citizen resistance and rebellion in the matter of Soviet borders? So the question was Soviet borders, but I think we can apply it to post-Soviet borders.
Ooh. That's a very interesting question, but
maybe you there are examples in the book of citizen resistance and rebellion along borders.
One had to make a definition of resistance. People at the borders are very tricky acting at the borders. That was for me a very interesting aspect of much. In much cases presented in our papers, that they for example in Central Asia, when the border was closed and they couldn't attend a funeral on the other side, but what you all know is very, very important for Muslim people, the families on one side of the border stood on one side of the border, and the other part of the family stood on the other side of the border, and they made the prayers together, for example. That's not resistance, and I can't remember that I read something about real resistance, but people have a lot of good ideas how to behave with the borders. Maybe one can take it as a resistance at the South Ossetian borders when people were jumping about these wires across these wires to change, but it's not real resistance. It's only a sign, how people try to adapt to this strange border. So resistance, but I would really like to know who has asked this question, and maybe the person has an example in mind. It would be very interesting for me.
Yes, I invite the person who asked the question to elaborate if they want to. Sabine, do you have an answer? Do you have elements to share as well on this question of citizen resistance and rebellion in the matter of Soviet borders?
Well, I mean, I think there would be probably two ways to look at it. So is it resistance to the border drawing and the border enforcement and bordering, or is it resistance to something else, and is that located in the border? And we have, of course, different levels, and Beata already mentioned these small examples of that, how people oppose to enforcing the border, and also how to oppose, especially maybe, and you can probably also interpret this as resistance to this nationalizing trends in, for instance, in the Fergana Valley, that people, despite these trends of demarcating a nationalizing state, they continue to interact across the border and to interact in water management. I don't know if that would count as rebellion or resistance, but it is opposing certain ways the state is from the center of the state in the periphery, enforcing and bordering situations. So maybe this could count in this way.
That is, in the case of the Fergana Valley and Isfahan, for example, one can take the behavior of people on both sides of the border as a resistance, but I would say they cannot accept the situation at all, and the problem in most cases is not resistance against the border, but that there is no defined border, no demarcated and delimited border. So the question should be I can only repeat my question. Can you please a little bit elaborate your question?
So actually, the person didn't have any more in mind and wanted some general comments. But what's interesting about what you said is that so there are two chapters, one on the Fergana Valley and the other one on the Isfahan Valley, and I think that's one of the assets of the book, is that these are chapters that are really based on qualitative work and ethnography in those regions which are in tension now, in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. So I think the book here is very timely to understand the dynamics along these particular borders. That was a personal comment. We have another question on the inner and external borders. So what is the qualitative difference between the observed dynamics defining the former inner Soviet borders compared to the observed dynamics defining the former external frontiers of the Soviet Union? It's a long question, so I took my time in reading it. And Sabina, do you wanna start answering?
So the question is, what is the qualitative difference?
So the difference between the dynamics observed defining the former inner Soviet borders, so the borders within the Soviet Union, compared to the dynamics defining the external frontiers of the Soviet Union. So the differences between the dynamics within the Soviet Union and the external frontiers of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, first maybe we need to mention that generally the external borders, and Beate maybe can add later on, the external borders were more or less clear in the demarcation and where they went, the internal borders were sometimes much more unclear, and a lot of delimitation had to take place from this, let's say, regulative and structural approach. So first of all, treaties had to be made about where these borders should go, and that took in many cases a lot of time. And then also regulations how to cross it had to be established, and that in some ways didn't have to be done with the external borders because they had been more or less clear. So, and the dynamics, and I think I tried to show this with a short overview I made. The dynamics at the external borders was suddenly more or less an opening of these borders that have been rather close. So exchange started between so in our book we have these Turkey-Georgian borders, so people came in contact, so and re-established contacts that had been more or less blocked before, and it's similar with the Kazakhstan-Chinese border, and then also in Kaliningrad. And these, but then and that I also try to say the dynamics diversify then later on. So we have in Kaliningrad, we have suddenly an enclave surrounded by the EU that is connected again with a lot of regulations that limits or develops certain interactions, while in other places the quality of the border regulations didn't change so much. And the internal, I think I would say, from the case studies we have in the book, is a lot about the demarcation problems. Where does the border go? And then a lot of contacts that have been in place suddenly had to deal with regulations about how to cross and when to cross and where to cross. So I think that probably would a little bit describe the differences between the internal and the external borders. From my first thoughts. Maybe do you have to add something?
First of all, I would like to add that there were some border issues because for example, between the Chinese People's Republic and the Soviet Union, there were a lot of border places not demarcated and delimited, and Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, for example, had, as very young and unexperienced states, had to make negotiations with China to come to a solution, not in every case to the best of the Central Asian states. But for me, the most interesting difference between the internal and between the expectations and what are the results of the research in our book is that we all would expect that when borders become more open and people at least can come in contact again, the world will become better and the relations will become better. And in all our cases in our book, the result is that matters are really complicated. And in the example of the Georgians in Turkey and Georgia, they had an idea of that they are one nation during the time of being departed, and when they could get in contact, they learned that they are very different at all. And in the case of Kaliningrad, that one could expect, but still relations were not the best, and there were a lot of distrust. And what are the relations between Central Asians and Chinese or China? That's subject for a whole lecture, I guess. So it's not so easy at all as well.
Thank you so much. You mentioned Georgia. We actually have a question partly on Georgia. Someone. Of course, thank you for your excellent presentations. So I'll read the question. How do you explain the difference in the greater interaction across the border between Moldova and Transnistria than the border between Georgia and South Ossetia? So that's the question. And then the person who asked elaborated, saying, would it be that South Ossetia is more closely aligned with Russia than Transnistria is? Or is it that there is much greater conflict between Georgia and Russia than Moldova and Russia? I think we can direct the question first to Sabina, because you worked a lot on Moldova in particular.
That is an interesting question. And so first question is that why is more interaction between Moldova and Transnistria and not so much between South Ossetia and Georgia? And I guess there the conflict is much more tense. and these are all dynamics that also are not very, that also surprised us, because you see all this geopolitical tension, which is made on in a geopolitical discourse, but then on the ground, a lot of things happen, and you can observe this also in Cyprus or Northern Cyprus and other cases where, despite the geopolitical conflict, there are pragmatic interactions on the ground. And I think it is how the conflict parties relate to each other and try to deal with the conflict. And then it is also, of course, the relation with Russia, and maybe also that Russia is so close to Georgia and is has direct also a direct border with South Ossetia, while in Transnistria and Moldova it's a little more distant, even though the dependency in both cases from Russia is the same. But still, the Moldovan political elites and also Transnistrian political elites somehow managed to continue these interactions from below better. And then maybe it also comes into play for the Moldovan Transnistrian case that we have Europe close, and the interactions that you see between Transnistria and the integration in the DCFTA of Transnistria and Moldova that gives, let's say, incentives also for Transnistria to allow these interactions with Moldova and the other way around. So I think it's some of the geopolitical constellations that are at play here that make the conflict resolution. And I think these low-level interactions at the Transnistrian Moldovan border also have to do with the negotiation formats that are placed there, that allow more contact there, and a harder situation between Georgia and South Ossetia, and the wars that have been taking place in 2008.
But we have to say, we didn't do the field research in both cases. We can only say what we read, and Sabina, of course, she did field research in the region, but when Ariane doesn't attend us, but when I remember the results of her research in Georgia or South Ossetia, her result was that the international, the interference of the international actors has a very bad influence on the situation on the border, and maybe that is one of the differences between the two cases. But I'm not sure, because I'm not a specialist in these areas. But for me, in nearly all articles, the most impressive was that people in the border regions in most cases found a way how to relate with the border, how to adapt to the situation, and they found some solution. They weren't happy about the situation, but there was an idea or will, or they had to find a solution how to act with this border. And that for me is a big difference to the normal approach in border research, looking on governments and treaties and so on. The result is totally different for me.
So maybe that's an invitation for a second volume, post-Soviet borders, with more field research and more examples. We have a question about a statement in the book. The book shows that the borders between the former Soviet republics are more closed than in Soviet times. Why is that so, and what are the examples given and explored in the book?
I'm afraid I didn't understand the question.
Oh, okay. So it says, the book shows that the borders between the former Soviet republics are more closed than in Soviet times. So that today the borders in the region are more closed than they were in the Soviet times.
Yeah.
So why is that so, and what are the examples given and explored in the book?
Why it is so? Because the former internal Soviet borders became international borders, and as new national states, all new republics, new former Soviet Union republics, they started demarcating their border and establishing border controls and so on at places where in former times you even didn't notice that you crossed the border. I remember, for example, a mountain hiking tour between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and there were, in the beginning at the end of the 90s, there were absolutely no sign that we changed from Kazakhstan to Kyrgyzstan, and 2 years later, it was impossible to change the border because of the economic union with Kazakhstan as a member and Kyrgyzstan still not a member, and there were border forces and nobody was allowed in the border area and so on. No doubt that the border are more closed, and for me it's typical for new national states that they tend to show where their territory is, and that they have their own statehood and so on. But the question why borders are a sign of statehood, it's some rather philosophical, I guess.
Sabine, did you want to answer that?
I think Beate basically answered the question, but because before the borders within the Soviet Union have been administrative borders, they didn't play a role at all for people crossing it, and people weren't aware where they are. So, and now when these former Soviet republics turn into independent states, suddenly they have to demarcate and secure sovereignty and so forth. So that makes these former almost not existing borders suddenly real barriers on the ground for the people.
Thank you. So we're getting towards the end of the webinar. We still have 5 minutes, and I thought this would probably be interesting to talk about Sabina's work on Ukrainian, the line of contact. Your research is very timely. Can you talk a little bit about this research and how the war in Ukraine has probably changed dynamics? And can you also present the field work, because it relates to borders as well?
Yes, definitely. And we did not integrate this in the book, but yes, well, we did this field work on the ceasefire line, or also contact line in eastern Ukraine that existed until last year before the war started. And what we did in this research is that we wanted to know about how people deal in their everyday life with this ceasefire line or contact line, which was about 400 kilometers long and had about, I think, 5 checkpoints where people could cross in a very, let's say, densely populated area. So the ceasefire line is basically, it stops where the people come to a ceasefire, so it doesn't follow any functional, social, or cultural connections. So people were somehow separated from their former centers in Luhansk and Donetsk, because it divided basically the suburbs of the center. And what came out in a way was that quite some people tried to keep up connections to that former centers, although it was very difficult and you needed a lot of time to travel there. But then also what I found interesting about the interviews we did there, but we worked with a local researcher who was very familiar with the region, Julia Abibok, and what I found interesting that the people, and what I have to add for the research is that we only talk to people on the government-controlled side of the ceasefire line. So it was difficult to get inside. So we only have what regards the qualitative interviews from the government-controlled area, and that we have there also other processes of bordering, because these people live in an extreme situation, because they are on the one hand disconnected from the former centers, but then on the other hand they are also, because it's a special civil military administration there, they are also somehow disconnected from the rest of Ukraine. So you have different bordering processes taking place in this context. This research is still important, probably also when we think about future ceasefire lines, but for now this ceasefire line disappeared since the open war of Russia against Ukraine. So that maybe just in brief. There are much more aspects about this, but if you have more questions, I can answer. But that's maybe only a brief description of what we did there. And that maybe just one more thing. What I also found interesting about this is this ambivalence between this ceasefire line as providing security from this violent conflict to a certain extent, but at the same time also providing or leading to a kind of insecurity, that people live in a very insecure state because a lot of everyday routines and connections disappear and are not re-established, because it's in kind of space of exception that leads again to this other bordering process I mentioned. I was not too confusing about this, but yeah.
Sorry, the mic was mute. No. I think it was very clear, and I encourage everyone who's interested in these matters and in your work to go and check Zoe's website. I cannot. I couldn't stop saying very positive things about Zoe's. I think the research there is very timely and needed, and I'll share the link to the website so that everyone can go and check the publications and be familiar with the work that you do there. And the good thing is that the website is both in German and English, which is helpful for people who don't speak German. And to finish, I will give you a few concluded words, but we had one of our participants who gave a perspective on the question about Georgia. So I'll read the comment. On the comparative question about Georgia and border with territories controlled by Russian troops, one should think about geographical distance, geographical proximity. The Russian troops in the I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce that. Valley region are only some 45 kilometers away from Tbilisi. Effective scale, immediate anxiety alone already plays the role. So we get back here to the idea of scales that is really at the center of your of the book, and the nexus between geography everyday experience. So so I'll give you a few words to conclude. Beate, if you wanted to share concluding remarks, and then Sabine.
Okay, I already did my concluding remarks. For me, it is, and that it will be the most interesting in border research to see the differences between this center relation between states and state administrations and the situation at the border, in the border regions, and how the border people react on the border situations. And for me, my personal concluding remark is the same as I did in the conclusion of our book. It's from Saudat Olimova and Mustafa Olimov. Life in the borderlands is contradictory. For me, it's the main result of our book.
Yes, absolutely. That appears in the conclusion of the book. Thank you for quoting them. Two researchers from Tajikistan who participated in the book. Sabina, did you want to say a few words before we end the webinar?
Yes, maybe briefly. Yeah, maybe also briefly to the comment. But I think the Russian forces are in Transnistria as well, not very far away from the capital of Moldova, Chisinau. But the Russian presence in South Ossetia is much bigger, and the collaboration between the military and the local military forces are much stronger. So. Yeah, just stop this here. I think there are no really, maybe because there were so many questions that regarded a little bit the, can we generalize, but somehow we see in these post-Soviet borders and in every border that very much depends on a very specific context and constellation. So I think that is always to consider, especially if we look at these perspectives and interlinkages between the state and the people actually in the borderland that are usually in the periphery of the state. And I think what will be interesting to continue this work, definitely, and to make maybe more comparisons with all the many other post-Soviet states, to have more also comparative cases to maybe come to some generalizations if possible. So we will definitely continue to work on this.
So let's think about a second volume, maybe a third one. But before we get there, I invite everyone to check the book. Part of it is open access, and I shared everything in the chat box. I'd like to thank again Beate Eschment and Sabine von Lewis for presenting the book on post-Soviet borders. Thank you to as well, a big thank you to our audience for their questions and for being part of this IRIS event. And feel free to go check IRIS website for forthcoming events on borders, on post-Soviet space, on anything related to this area. Thank you again so much, and have a great day, afternoon, or evening.
Okay. Well, thank you. Also,
thank you.
Thank you for the good questions.